Fridman. She's the author of Foreigners, Aliens, Citizens, a case study on the experience of Jewish people in England from 1066 to 1939. Good morning, Irina.
Good morning, Peter.
What's the book about?
Oh, it's about the relationship. It's about the relationship between the Jewish community and the Christian community and how it was shaped, influenced by the legislation, by the military campaigns, by the politics that were happening at the time. And it's basically, as you said, it's a case study spanning quite a substantial period of time.
With actual lessons for the present and the future as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. What's unusual and different about the book?
Well, first of all, I don't think that anyone tried to write a history of a certain Jewish community spanning over such a long period of time. But also, it's a case study of one of the community in Kent. Kent is interesting because, despite the fact that there were various communities around here, there were no comprehensive study at all. And local historians do not mention any parts of history which are not commonly known. Mm-hmm. For example, again, I'm referring to this case study: history of the dockyard, history of the cathedral, history of the castle, etc. But the minority communities are not there. You can't find it anywhere else. So basically, we are not hearing the voices that should be heard. We don't see the history through the lens of the people who settled there, who contributed a lot to this community, overall community, but who are totally unknown.
The story begins at 1066, so take us on from there.
Okay. 1066 is obviously known, Battle of Hastings. We get William the Conqueror, who comes and conquers England. As a matter of fact, Kent was unusual in this respect because they were not conquered, they just signed a treaty. So, and that's the period when, for the first time, a Jewish community settles here. It was useful for William to have some people who knew, so Jewish community from Rouen. It is common knowledge that he had a special relationship with the Jewish community of Rouen, to come, settle here, and obviously help him to establish the country, to change the face of the country the way he saw it fit.
Okay. And nearly 200 years later, around 1290, something else happened, expulsion. Sort of fill that gap in, please.
Yes. On the 18th of July, 1290, Edward I ordered all the Jews in the country, and we're talking about a very small number by that time, because by that time Jewish communities were totally impoverished. Their mainly usefulness was over that period, over those 200 years, was paying money to the king, supplying funds for his campaigns. Unfortunately, they were squeezed completely out of every possible option of paying those taxes, and they were ordered to leave by the 1st of November. Despite the fact that the king mentioned to give them a free passage and not to bother Jews whilst they're leaving, of course, various unpleasant situations occurred, such as drowning a whole ship of them, or, for example, one of the rare images, probably the only image, which is from Rochester Chronicle, so it is based in Rochester. Admittedly, it was It was written, Rochester Chronicle was written a bit later, after the expulsion, but it is significant that this violent scene is based in Rochester. We've got a Christian person with a club threatening 3 Jews. They're wearing their badges, identifying them as Jews. Whether they were Jews residing here, I doubt it, because we don't have any records, we don't have any recollection. It's really difficult to establish, or they probably were Jews who were passing on the way out, on their way there.
I am reminded of how current this is because we're sitting in a synagogue in Chatham and Rochester on the sort of border of those areas, and 30 or so years ago, I myself got chased along the road with an openly gay friend of mine who I was in a punk band with by some squaddies. We'll come to the story of that later on. Got my head kicked in just down the road. Not a terrible memory now, but clubs and stuff. There are clubs in Medway. The casino ruins, we shall mention them later on, I'm sure.
It's the image of the other, which is always a scary one.
And so xenophobia has many forms and what have you.
And guises, yes.
Yeah, okay. The imagery across the sort of 400 or so years from the 13th to the 17th century, obviously exemplified through literature, but I mean, take us through some of how that sort of came to pass.
Well, they expelled all the Jews physically, but to say that they didn't stay, it would be a mistake, because what you get, the fear of them, that fear of the other, transformed itself into a symbol of a bogeyman. And it is used in various works, in works of Chaucer, in works of Marlowe, in the works of Shakespeare. Later on in the 19th century, we have the same with Dickens.
Okay. The Merchant of Venice is one such example.
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, in popular culture, we have Fagin and things like that, which, when as a child, when I watched the film, I didn't realise the significance of it, but clearly it's embedded in a deep level, and even when people weren't present, this was going on.
Absolutely, and Dickens mentions Jews quite a few times, and he mentions them in the local, relating to the local area, because, as you know, he lived nearby. He lived near Rochester in Hyme. He mentions Jews in his non-fictional, so to speak, stories. Interestingly enough, one of them he just lifts a whole description from the 18th century writer. We would call it today it's plagiarizing, but he adds his own bit, which is terribly unpleasant. The only positive image that he tries to portray was the later on in Our Mutual Friend, but somehow I'm not convinced that that was a sincere depiction.
Okay. He's probably enraged at the awful train service from South Eastern from Hyme to Chatham at the time, and probably thought, who do I blame for that? So there we have it. Okay, let us move on to more serious matters. For a moment, things got momentarily better with Cromwell and readmission, did it not, around the 1650s? Or it seemed to.
Well, that was an interesting period because prior to readmission there were several attempts from various Christian groups who suddenly got interested. They got interested in Judaism, in the going back to the Old Testament, going back to the Scripture as it was written originally. So there were various attempts to appeal for the readmission of Jews into this country. They didn't succeed. Then in the 1650s, again, there was this appeal by Menashe ben Israel, a rabbi from Amsterdam, to Cromwell to readmit Jews and allow them to settle in the country. To be truthful, there was no explicit admission. So the readmission was kind of by the back door, and
I kind of wondered if it was going to be a token story.
by the back door, and the legitimacy of Jews settling in this country came only through the legal processes, which were challenged all the way.
We have to do 1,000 years of history in a very short time, so it is irritating, but we jumped to 1753 and sort of naturalisation, so take us on to there, please.
Oh, that was, again, an interesting period. One of the major legislations, which was debated at the time, 1753, it was so-called a Jew bill, or naturalisation bill, would have allowed Jews to be naturalised. From the legal perspective, it meant that there wouldn't have been an issue of inheritance, there wouldn't have been an issue of letting or renting property, or maybe even possibly owing the land, though that comes much, much later. Jews were not allowed to own any land till the mid-19th century. As you can imagine, the fierce battle, and we had great anti-Jewish, well, great is a sort of an interesting word, but anti-Jewish campaign, which claimed, and let me just read a couple of lines from the book. So there were various arguments. No Jews, no wooden shoes. That was the reference to Jews in Amsterdam, who were the first to settle here. The attempts were that it would have been Christians claimed that it would be rob them of their birthright as Christians, that the swarms of Jews would come and settle in the country. Others argued that Jewish merchants were a threat to the English ones, that Jews would force the Protestants out of all offices, trades and professions, that they were a threat to the female population, as daughters would be forced to marry rich Jews. The previous old rumour, which originated in the 17th century, of that St. Paul's Cathedral would be converted into a synagogue, was revived, as well as a well-trodden path of blood libel. A novel argument claimed that the eventual act would reduce the consumption of ham and bacon.
So you can't have your bacon sarnie then. This literally reaches down into the stomachs of English people, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We're talking about...
although this seems funny and we're laughing about it, this has hugely important resonances to how people think about things to this day.
Absolutely. Now, let me just give you a little bit of stats. The estimates, well, there's no concrete data, but the estimates that there were between 5.5 and 6 million people in England and Wales at the time, but the Jewish population was about 8,000. Mm-hmm. That's all we're talking about.
Number,
it's less than percent.
Yeah, and it's the sort of school ground bully thing of pick on a minority and sort of amplify that. And it rather also proves that fake news, which we live with daily, isn't exactly new.
No, it isn't. But it's also the ridiculousness of the news, of this rumour that, reducing the consumption of ham and bacon.
And it's parodied by the likes of Sacha Baron Cohen in the Borat and what have you, Jews having horns and other things.
Absolutely.
This stuff is embedded deeply in people's psyche through thousands of years or hundreds of years.
Yes.
And of course it causes all sorts of real difficult problems, and that's, to laugh at it is to misunderstand the impact, isn't it?
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed.
Okay, in 1829, there was apparently a bit of light at the tunnel. Of course, it didn't end very well because the Catholics got some things, but the Jews didn't.
Yes, we're talking about 1829 Act, which removed the disabilities of the Catholics and nonconformists, but the clause that required taking the sacrament was still retained. Mm-hmm. By that time, Jews, of course, many Jews, probably most, probably all of them, were born in this country. Mm-hmm. They considered it their home, so that the retention of the clause that excluded them to take part in the running of the country, to take part in all the affairs of the country, which they considered their home, was seen as a slight. And so we get the campaign, which took quite a few decades to get to the full equality in 1858.
Mm-hmm. And you said, they were offended, it was a slight, but there's a practical consequence of being excluded as well, as we see in modern times with citizens who have to reapply for their rights every 5 years under the Brexit regime. So you're never actually settled, even though apparently you have settled status. It's unsettled status, but it's magnified hugely in your story through all sorts of practical things that people couldn't do because of, their status.
Absolutely. They were excluded from many professions. They were excluded from guilds because every single guild, every single profession beyond the entry point of supplying, like in Chatham, second-hand clothing or being slightly entrepreneurial on your own accord, required taking of the sacrament. So there was very limited framework in which Jews could operate. And the fact that a constant reference, which you hear even today about the reference connecting Jews to money, is steeped deeply in the fact that they were excluded from absolutely everything. They were, as you said, unsettled. And money is the only commodity, more or less, that you can easily take with you.
Okay.
It's easy to move.
Okay. The Russians are coming. What's behind that headline?
Okay. You are referring to the late 19th century when, following the so-called May laws, very anti-Semitic laws of the Russian Empire, again we are seeing quite a big wave of immigration out of Russia, and many Jews come here and settle here, probably in a sort of a similar vein as we have immigrants, refugees. That's a better word for it.
Yeah.
From Syria, from those Afghanistan, from those countries today. So they come here, they settle. Of course, there's quite a big community. There was a big backlash about the immigration. Again, the same story. They'll take over all the jobs. They'll reduce the consumption of ham and bacon. Exactly the same as we hear today. And that's the point where anti-Semitism, which seemed to have got eliminated by that time from the establishment, suddenly comes back.
So this is a chronic disease of the human condition, of seeing the other as a threat.
Unfortunately, I was interested to explore how much we progressed as human beings, as human race, over the centuries.
And your conclusion was?
I'm afraid not very far. We're using exactly the same arguments with more or less the same words. And anti-immigrant rhetoric permeates the society from top to bottom.
Okay. Around the sort of First World War, of course, it dropped down to what you were called, didn't it? People's names. I mean, so tell me about sort of Germans and naming or other races, but the names.
Right. With the start of the First World War, the word German became obviously a cursed word. So many Jews of who were living here had German-sounding names because they came from the Russian Empire. They were Ashkenazi Jews, which meant they originated centuries ago somewhere around Germany along the way. But they were not German subjects. Most of them came from Poland and came from the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. They had German-sounding names. They spoke Yiddish, which is a language based on the combination of languages. It absorbed quite a few languages, including English, German, Russian, Hebrew, etc. Mm-hmm. So between themselves they conversed, and that created great scares. They had to change their names in order to blend in, in order not to stand out. That not always happened. In 1915, several of them, the chairman of the Jewish community here had to publish in the local newspapers a declaration: no Germans live here in this area. All Jews are from the Russian Empire.
Yes, because there was a resonance and an echo of that in the 1950s when the Caribbean people came on the Windrush and other boats here. There was a fascinating documentary where a lot of the people who came here were saying, well, we dress like English gentlemen with ties and suits and tried to blend in. Obviously, there's a slight difficulty if you're a different colour to do that, but we really tried to blend in to, calling ourselves John because our name might be difficult to pronounce and things like that. It's very subtle, but it's really...
It is very significant because exactly the same was happening with the Jewish immigrants, Jewish refugees who came here. They were trying to blend in. Respectability was the key. Fagin was not a representative of the whole of the Jewish community. Yeah. There's no doubt there were some people, like in every single community, like in every single nation, there would be a very tiny segment of the society who would live on those margins in the criminal sort of shadows, but the vast majority of the people try to blend in, especially in this particular community. Respectability and blending in, be hardworking. That was the key.
Yes, and in even more recent times, I worked with the people who produced the book called In Limbo, which talked about the experience of 3 million EU citizens feeling that they were citizens of nowhere. And I like to point out that we're all citizens of nowhere under Brexit. But this book is not about Brexit, but it is about many of the underlying things. Therefore, it's relevant to every field of populism.
Absolutely.
In the world.
Well, there are parallels.
Yeah.
There are parallels between Brexit and there are parallels with this book.
Okay. I was going to say let us move on to something happier, but it isn't particularly so, because my next question is about Mosley and this phrase that he... tell us about Mosley, but eventually we'll get to the phrase he coined, which is the will of the people, which is directly relevant now. But Mosley came to these towns and, of course, came to a lot of places to stir people up before the Second World War.
Yes. Mosley positioned himself as the only saviour of the nation against Bolshevism, which, of course, he conflated with the image of a Jew.
Yeah.
He visited the Medway towns several times. One of the biggest occasions was in Rochester in June 1936, where in the casino rooms...
Or the casino at the time, but yes,
yes,
it's still there. But
yes,
it's now a dance floor.
Yeah.
It was a scene for stirring up hatred at that time.
Yes, where he declared that he and the fascist movement was delivering the will of the people at the time. And I have to say, this phrase reminds me of a different recent phrase
Yes, coined by Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, and all of these people to create this binary condition: you're either with us or you're against us.
Indeed.
And we didn't mention the attempts by the Christians to say you're either going to be saved or you're dead. But this is a very persuasive argument, but many things in life are not binary, are they?
No. Our world is grey, if you want to say, but grey in a different way. It is not boring, but it is chaotic. It is not binary. It is not linear. And it is hard to navigate in it, but it's definitely does not conform to the binary choice of either with us or against us.
And busy people and politicians are prone to using the light switches on or it's off. And really most world problems are analogue, like a dimmer switch, and they need real understanding and dialogue to understand what the issues are, and rather than just saying it's this or that. Yeah. Okay. So Mosley was not a great influence either on, and of course it helped lead us towards the Second World War and so on. Yes, but
the presence of fascists was visible here because there are quite a few reports. They were distributing their publications. Luckily, people of the Medway towns, the vast majority, voted against them, so they didn't win any seats here.
Yes, and that's still the same as well, that there are a few loud voices around the towns, which I occasionally get pelted with things as I go about, but the vast majority of people are great here, actually. But they don't want to know. People turn away from those few people that do those things, and sometimes one has to stand up to them.
Yes, there's usually complacency to minimise those unpleasant voices, those populist voices, to minimise their significance.
So, what are then the lessons from this book for the future, not just of people living here, but people living in Britain, and in fact people living all over the world that might want to learn from what it's like to be an isolated group or a marginalised group, and how to become one people rather than in little units? What are the lessons, you feel?
Well, as you can see, the book finishes in 1939. This is the start of the Second World War. Most people, and I'm saying most because there are dissenting voices, populist voices, who deny it, but to the majority of people there is no denial. They do know what happened to the European Jewry. It was more or less decimated. Holocaust happened. The survivors of the Holocaust are very old today, and they are passing away. My fear is that the Holocaust, that horror, becomes just a distant memory, and it's a story which has no relation, no relevance to the future generations, and that shouldn't happen at all. Otherwise, we are in great danger to repeat these horror stories. And I think that education is the key. It's important to educate every single person about Holocaust, about the events, the Holocausts that happened later on, like Rwanda. It's very important to do it in a way that it doesn't just tick the box. We've done it. Yeah. Okay. It has to be significant. It has to be something that resonates to everyone.
Yes, and in my life, some people like to go to the beach for a holiday. I took my children one time to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which they may not have fully thanked me for at the time, but important that people learn. On a slightly more positive note, I think everyone should watch it. It's a Wonderful Life. and also if they can bear it, or no, also because they must bear it, they must watch Schindler's List to understand and connect with, because it's all too easy to be emotionally detached from bad stuff and say, well, I just live my life. So I think actually we need special ways to educate people so that they can't live the experience, but they kind of understand the experience. There's some empathy.
Yes, yes. It's very important to educate people to be compassionate, to be understanding, to not to be fearful of the other, but be open about differences. We don't have to be uniformed.
Okay. Thank you very much for talking to me about foreigners, aliens and citizens, and I hope that we'll all be citizens of the world one day.
My pleasure, Peter.